Hello, this is David Ranson, and this is our client webcast for February 2023. The subject is why there has been no recession and none on the way. Conventional wisdom has been expecting a US recession for at least a year, but it has been wrong. Economists argue from the Ukraine war, Fed rate hikes, and innumerable economic threats, both real and imagined. But events keep working out differently from expectations. Forecasters have much yet to learn about recessions. It's not subtle science. Much of the evidence for a rethink is hiding in plain sight. The pandemic period and the post-shutdown performance of national output teach many lessons which forecasters have been slow to learn. Their models misconstrue the economy as a machine driven by a combination of animal spirits and government policy. They fail to recognize it as a natural system, adaptive and self-driven. And they pay little or no attention to the economy's inherent resilience. As in biology, chemistry, and throughout the sciences, nature's purpose is always to seek or regain equilibrium. A natural system evolves, grows, recovers from its wounds, and dodges obstacles. It's easy to see how the economy so often defeats the purposes of powers that seek to control it. There is much to learn simply from studying the observed path of the economy. Exhibit 1 shows how real GDP has evolved on a month-to-month basis over the past few years. This monthly perspective is not available to most people because the official GDP data are quarterly, produced inside the government from unpublished monthly inputs. Although the private sector can and does produce what the authorities choose not to, the media are Washington-focused and slow to recognize that such data exist. This chart provides an informative perspective in hindsight that is easier to diagnose. Up to now, it's a perspective of which the public have largely been deprived. The central feature of the previous exhibit is the calamity that real GDP suffered during the pandemic. It's strikingly similar to the typical case of plunge and rebound in the stock market in Exhibit 2, which shows the market crash of 2008 and the rebound of 2009. This is not the picture of setback and recovery that's characteristic of most recessions, but students of stock market volatility will quickly recognize this shape of the economy's recovery path. Investors know that a market plunge signals not merely a faltering economy, but a surprise jump of uncertainty. As the shock dissipates, the market rebounds, rapidly at first, but slowing as it climbs. This asymptotic rebound path lends itself to extrapolation. In the rare case of a disaster as large as COVID, the economy tends to behave like the stock market. This helps explain the brevity of the economic hiccup in 2020, 2021, so different from the last recession in 2008-09. Output plunges abruptly. When the shock hits, everyone freezes and many activities just stop. But it bounces back as fears subside, although the speed of rebound is never as rapid as the collapse. Recovery follows a curve that is asymptotic in shape, as in this close-up picture in Exhibit 3. These rebounds put in the stock market and economy are a picture of equilibrium-seeking behavior. The economy puts its resources back to work after the disaster, seeking to regain the path from which it was thrown. Far from a symptom of trouble that will lead to a new setback, these are a prescription for steady growth. The speed of the growth will depend on two things: the passage of time since the plunge tends to decline, and the extent to which the political environment is business friendly. The most discussed factor that motivates recessions or recession forecasts is fear of damage from Fed rate hikes. That the Fed was responsible for recessions in the past, as through the 1980s at least, is not in doubt. But it's quite easy to see that the impact of interest rate movements on GDP is less than it was. Exhibit 4 illustrates that it has been diminishing constantly and consistently with the passing decades. 20 years ago, it had entirely disappeared. One explanation is the Fed's new policy of providing forward guidance of its interest rate plans. Eliminate the surprise and you eliminate much of the damage. Another is the increased size and depth of financial markets and their ability to hedge against a variety of risks. An interest rate hike is just one such risk. Today, given this market robustness and the missing element of surprise, the Fed may have lost the ability it once had to cause a hard landing. Capital markets have always been a source of warning signals for the economy. For one of the most popular among business cycle analysts has always been credit market spreads. For decades, the yield spread between Baa and AAA corporate bonds has been a favorite indicator in the US. All US recessions have been signaled by major spread widening, and Exhibit 5 shows that 2020 was no exception. Spreads provide warning, even of a soft landing, such as the one that occurred in 2016, as you see. This chart shows data for the past 4 years expressed in two different ways. The basis point difference between Baa and AAA, which is in the digits, the figures attached to the data points, and the ratio between them, which is the way the vertical axis has been constructed. Whichever version is used, credit spreads did give a massive warning signal of recession in 2020. But sometimes it makes a big difference which metric for credit spreads is used. The yield ratio is the less popular indicator of the two. But Exhibit 6 shows historical evidence suggesting it's more reliable than the simple basis point spread. The difference is immaterial as long as the general level of interest rates is stable. But when rates are on the rise, as they have been recently, the basis point spread will rise as well. That could give a false signal. And that's when the yield ratio gives a different signal, unaffected by the general rate increase. The recent constancy of the yield ratio, as we saw in the last graph, successfully to date has suggested no recession. Exhibit 7 shows how spreads jumped and declined in 2020. Both metrics jumped abruptly in March and April. Unfortunately, this was one of those occasions when they were unable to provide useful warning. From early in 2022, the basis point spread has risen from 65 to 117. There you see at the right-hand end of the graph. But our preferred yield ratio indicator shows little or no change. It's basically where it was a year and a half ago on the vertical scale. The fact that no recession has shown up yet suggests that the yield ratio does continue to be the better indicator. I'd like to turn now to less well understood aspects of recessions, summarizing some of what I've already been discussing and a couple of other points. Recessions can be caused by any number of problems that the economy finds it hard to cope with. Small economic setbacks are routine and so numerous that we are hardly aware of them. But significant US recessions are very infrequent. Since the 1990s, the US has suffered only two, in 2008 and 2020. This is true despite plenty of turbulence, and it's probably attributable to the strength of the market system, as I suggested before. Stable growth is normal. The economy's rate of expansion can never be constant, but it doesn't have to be volatile. Consumers and producers value consistency highly, and to achieve it, they're willing to invest in insurance in one form or another. An essential ingredient for recession is surprise or shock. Economic threats that are widely anticipated rarely lead to recessions. Corrective or evasive actions begin as soon as an obstacle to the economy's path becomes recognized. The cost of these efforts may, of course, depress growth. And finally, the economy is resilient. A recession is a temporary departure from its equilibrium growth path. It rebounds once the element of shock is gone. To the extent that a setback is sustained, something more robust, something more serious is probably going wrong. At this point, I'd like to turn to my colleague, David Campbell, who will ask some further questions regarding what we've been talking about.
There is an almost complete consensus that a recession is about to impact the US and other Western economies. Yet, David, it's a plain fact that the unemployment remains low and hiring continues. Isn't this a contradiction?
It's not an outright contradiction. Employment usually grows in rough proportion to national output, but not commensurately and not all the time. Output per man and output per man hour are measures of productivity that vary, depending upon many factors. Unemployment is a lagging indicator and tells us relatively little. Still, labour market activity certainly doesn't suggest a forthcoming recession.
Where does this consensus on recession stem from? Is it groupthink? If so, why does the group think this? Is it simply fear of the Fed?
To some extent, the consensus is driven by emotion as much as by rational calculation. When people are fearful about the future, it will affect their forecasts and their actions.
The elephant in the economist's room is inflation. Central bankers across the Western world have clearly demonstrated their failure to anticipate or explain the escalation of price inflation. Why should we believe that they can now engineer a suppression of inflationary pressures?
It's a good question. A doctrine that can't explain the abrupt onset of inflation is not well positioned to explain how to restrain it. We have already overinvested in the Fed's belief system. Over the years, other doctrines and alternative insights have been buried or pushed aside. Some are still viable and deserve to be re-examined.
Is the Western world's monetary system no longer fit for purpose? And can anything be done to create a more effective monetary system to promote growth without uncontrolled inflation? Or are these expectations of a monetary system unrealistic?
Today's Western monetary world can scarcely be called a system anymore. The Bretton Woods system, launched during World War II, survived for 25 years, during which time its members experienced growth without significant inflation. The linchpin of that system was the US dollar's convertibility into gold. Washington pulled the plug when it came under financial pressure as a result of the enormous cost of the Vietnam War. Convertibility ended. Very soon, exchange rates were floating, and countries could facilitate state spending by devaluing their currencies at will. The lesson to be learned is that governments cannot be trusted to stick to the rules, and it's hard to imagine a system that could force them to do that. Well, thank you, David, for those questions. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in the webcast. I look forward to the next webcast in May. Thank you.